friends. Thank you, everyone, for who has joined or will join us. I understand that we have great difference in time, so I hope that everyone could see sometime us. So, as you know, English is not my first language, but so my English leaves much to desire. But I hope that you can understand me. And God knew that if I was born in USA, I would have great English, but it's not the case in this situation. But I will not speak in much because my guests will be. So thank you so much for your time. And today I have with me Dr. Ryan Mullins and Dr. Cajetan Cuddy, both great guys. I'm a fan of both of you. Thank you for your time. And maybe let's briefly introduce yourself. So let's start with Dr. Mullins. Briefly describe who you are and what you're doing.
Yeah, so I have a PhD in theology from the University of St. Andrews and a doctoral habilitation from the University of Helsinki in dogmatics. I am a lecturer in philosophy and theology at the University of Lucerne, and then a regular visiting professor in philosophy at Palm Beach Atlantic University. And then I'm a docent of dogmatics at Helsinki as well, which I don't exactly know what that means, but it sounds cool. So, I thought I'd bring it up. So I mainly work in philosophical theology. I've written a lot on philosophy of time, God's relationship to time, different models of God. And then I'm trying to get into the different theories of providence at the moment. I've only published a few things on that so far, so it's still a bit of an amateur at that. But yeah, I'll stop there.
Yeah. And you also have music, and on your podcast we could hear something from your music. Is that great?
Yeah, get a heavy metal every once in a while. So yeah, it'll be good.
Okay, Dr. Cuddy, what about you?
So yeah, I'm Father Cajetan Cuddy. I'm a professor of dogmatic and moral theology at the Dominican House of Studies in Washington, D.C. And as per the attire and the name of the institution, I'm a Dominican friar, Roman Catholic priest. And my specialty is the philosophy and theology of St. Thomas Aquinas and the Thomist tradition. And as someone who did his doctorate in Europe, I'm very impressed with my colleague here, your credentials. Those are serious programs and serious institutions that you teach in. So I very much look forward to this exchange.
Yeah, I hope to see great discussion. So topic for our discussion today is what is divine providence, and we would have just open discussion dialogue about this topic. And for our listeners, if you have any questions or comments, you can leave in the chat, and we will discuss maybe in the near future. But let's start with some description of our positions. So let's maybe start with Dr. Mullins, and could you describe what is the Molinism position in general?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I prepared a statement here. So I'll just go through this. So I've affirmed Molinism or something in the neighborhood of Molinism because I don't affirm every single thing that Luis de Molina himself affirmed, because there's certain problems that Molinism faces that I just don't know how to address at all. But what I'll do today is try to make it as plausible as I can. So here's the idea. So I believe that God is eternal, and that just means that God exists without beginning and without end. And then I also believe that God is temporal, and that means that God can have temporal location, and God can undergo succession. So God exists right now, God exists at this moment, and then God exists over a series of successive moments. Because a moment of time is the way things are, but could be subsequently otherwise. So God does one thing and then another. God existed before this dialogue started, and then God will continue to exist forever and ever. Amen. So God is eternal and temporal. And then I also affirm the doctrine of creation ex nihilo that's been widely understood across the Abrahamic faiths. So according to its proponents and its critics, creation ex nihilo affirms that God once existed all alone. So prior to any sort of creative act, God existed all alone. There wasn't any material stuff. There were no other beings that were co-eternal with God. There was just God and nothing else. And then for some reason, God created our universe. And God did not have to create, but for some reason he did create. And that creative act to bring about our universe, it's a new moment in the life of God. At least that's how I understand it. Now, I want to say God is perfectly rational. So God always performs actions on the basis of objectively good reasons. So when God created the universe, God had a reason for doing so. And that reason, whatever it was, involves obtaining a goal that did not eternally obtain. Because after all, if God already had something, then he wouldn't act to obtain it. So God performs a new action in order to obtain something that he did not eternally have. And this is why we as Christians can say that the universe exists for a reason or a purpose. So God created the universe for a reason in order to obtain some goal or set of goals. So here's the important question to consider for today. What was God doing before he created the universe? So St. Augustine tells us that, like, this old joke that God was creating hell for people who ask those kind of questions. And that, I think, is a very funny joke, but I prefer what the Apostle Paul has to say in Ephesians 1. So according to Paul, prior to creation, God was plotting to take over the world. So before God freely created this universe, God selected a goal and he devised a plan to achieve that goal. This plan is what we call predestination. So before God creates the universe, God had a destiny in mind for the cosmos. And according to Jesus in the Gospel of John, one of God's goals is friendship with humanity, and sending Jesus is part of the plan to achieve that goal. So predestination is God's plan for creation. Providence is the execution of that plan over a series of moments. So providence is a description of the actions that God performs in time in order to achieve his stated goal or destiny for the created order. And none of this is unique to Molinism. So now here's the part where Molinism comes in. So Molinism has a particular story to tell about how all of this works. So Molinism provides some of the details for predestination, creation, and providence. So Molinism tries to give you the details of God's decision-making process, what God knew at various points, and then how God is free over creation. And so here are a few of those details, as I understand it. So following the lead of John Duns Scotus, Molinism talks about these so-called logical moments in the timeless life of God. And I don't think that's coherent. I've published a few papers on this, just kind of calling into question the coherence of logical moments in the timeless life of God. Because the problem I see you get is a whole lot of eternal contradictions in the life of God. And I don't want eternal contradictions in God's life. That's a pretty terrible position. So I prefer to take the so-called logical moments and just say they are temporal moments. So here's the idea. So the first moment is called natural knowledge. And this is because God knows his nature. Like, that's it. That's all that God knows. And in having a perfect grasp of his nature, God knows all the necessary truths, including all those things that he could possibly create. And so here's something important to know that gets glossed over a lot in these discussions. So at the moment of natural knowledge, God does not know the future. This is because there is no settled future to know. God has not even decided if he will create or not create. There's no settled future yet because God has not made a choice. And at the moment of natural knowledge, God knows what could be, but he does not know what will be, because there are no facts of matter about what will be yet. And then at the next moment, so God decides to engage in some sort of hypothetical scenarios. What would happen if I were to create a universe? This is the sort of question that God asks himself. This brings us to the moment of middle knowledge. So at the moment of middle knowledge, God is considering a subset of all the logically possible things he could create. And since I think one of God's goals is to enter into friendship with humans, that narrows down the range of possible universes for God to consider. God will only be considering universes that contain biological life, such as humans, because if that universe doesn't have humans, then that doesn't fit God's goal. Also, God will only be considering universes that contain humans with significant freedom. In order to enter into genuine friendship with humanity, humans need to have a freedom and autonomy where they can develop their character in virtuous ways. So the freedom to make all manner of choices to develop their character in order to become the kind of people that God can call trustworthy friends. These humans cannot have all of their actions determined by God. Otherwise, moral development and genuine friendship are impossible. So at the moment of middle knowledge, God is only considering these possible universes that contain humans with genuine freedom. The Molinist says that at the moment of middle knowledge, God knows what all of these humans would freely do if he were to create them. At the moment of natural knowledge, God knows what he could create. At the moment of middle knowledge, God knows what would happen if he created a particular universe. And then God uses this knowledge to select one particular universe to bring about, and then he freely creates that particular universe. And so this brings us to the moment of free knowledge. And it's called free knowledge because God knows what he has freely decided to do. God has freely decided to create this particular universe with this particular timeline. And this is the basis for God's foreknowledge. Because remember, at the moment of natural knowledge, God does not know the future because he has not decided if he will even create anything at all. There was no settled future then for God to know. But things are different at the moment of free knowledge. At this moment, at this point, God has freely decided to create a universe with a settled timeline. And thus there's stuff to know about the future that God has freely chosen to create. And then before ending, I just want to clarify something here. So there are different ways that the future can be settled or open, and these different ways demarcate Molinism from rival views like theological determinism or open theism. So as I understand it, the Molinists can say that the future is settled in terms of alethetic settledness. So this means that the truth values of propositions about what will happen, they have a deterministic value of true or false. The propositions about what will happen are settled. However, the Molinists can say that the future is causally and ontically open. So I affirm presentism, which means that only the present moment of time exists. So the future is ontically open, which just means that those future moments, they don't literally exist yet, which might imply that the future is causally open, which means that the way the world is at the present does not causally determine exactly what must happen next. There is genuine causal input from God and creatures that brings about what happens next. It's not like God is the only agent who is free and who is directly causing everything to happen, nor is God causing secondary causal activity of creatures to bring about everything that happens. So that's at least Molinism, or whatever I affirm that's in the neighborhood. That's the view in a nutshell.
Okay, thank you so much. That was great. And for listeners who are from Ukraine and near countries, as you know, I'm a Reasonable Faith chapter in Ukraine. And for people who don't quite understand everything, I promise you that we will translate this discussion in Ukrainian sometimes in future. So I hope that you could understand this in our languages. Maybe, who knows, because it's hard stuff. Okay, so Dr. Cuddy, your time. So let's go.
So good. Yeah, thank you. So several things about Thomism by way of introduction. Thomism can be understood as the thought and the continuation of the thought of St. Thomas Aquinas. I prefer to speak rather of Thomism as intellectual monasticism, and that title distinguishes Thomism from the historical person of Aquinas and what the real questions about reality that transcend the Middle Ages, namely Aquinas' own time. So as a Thomist, Thomists are not simply interested in repeating or studying Aquinas, the man, the person, the historical figure, but Thomists are so called because they appropriate and utilize and apply the first principles that were dear and important and central, foundational to Aquinas' own thought, to new questions, concerns, or even old questions and concerns that Aquinas might not have or did consider. So in other words, Thomism is an intellectual monasticism because just as a monastery takes time and space and orders it around God, architecturally, the schedule of the day, the attire. So Thomism is taking principles, thoughts, concepts, and ordering them around God as well. And so therefore, if Thomism is something akin, analogous to an intellectual monastery, one of the central rooms in that intellectual monastery is God's providence, divine providence, and then related to it, predestination. And providence, in a word, we could say, refers to how God knows the world, creation to be. So with Aquinas' presentation of divine providence and the Thomist tradition's appropriation, reception of Aquinas' understanding of providence, we maintain that God knows what he creates. This is very evident if you have an artist who wishes to sculpt from clay a statue. He or she must have in the mind first an understanding of what they're going to make. In order to make, art presupposes in the mind of the artist a form, the divine idea, the divine concept in God of what he is to create. And then through creation, he imparts to the things he creates the knowledge that he has of them in the form of their nature. So from all eternity, God knows what a tree is. From all eternity, God knows what human nature is, what the human person is, what human marriage is, what new life is, what a bird is, what a blade of grass is. And so providence, first and foremost, refers to the order in reality that pre-exists in God and is expressed outside of God in this order of things. And then there are two ways that creatures participate in the order of providence. The first way, of course, bespeaks the fact that every being whether it is sentient, alive, able to know in some way or another reality, or not alive, inanimate, or inert, rather, inanimate. They all participate passively in divine providence, which is to say the rock, the human person, the bird, the angel, all participate passively in the order of providence, which means they are ordered and receive in their very natures and existence how God knows the world to be. So every being participates passively in the order of providence. However, rational creatures uniquely participate in the order of providence actively, which is to say, unlike the rock and the tree, which receive in their being God's knowledge of their being and of their order, rational creatures are able to look at themselves and other beings and think God's thoughts after him. So by looking at a rock or a tree, I'm able to understand what a rock or a tree is. And in knowing the nature of a rock or a tree, because that nature originates in the divine intellect and the divine ideas, the rock or the tree that I know mediates to me the divine providential order that's in the mind of God himself. So that's the foundation of providence. Providence exists first and foremost in the fact that all things are created and exist according in their being, according to the order of divine knowledge. There is no such thing as a being without an end, a goal, a purpose. Endless beings are impossible, strictly speaking. All beings passively receive God's ordering in their very nature. To have a nature means to have an end, to have a purpose, to be inclined in certain ways. All beings have that. And what rational creatures uniquely have, namely human persons and the angels, is the ability to participate both passively and actively in the order of providence. Now, and this brings us in my concluding words to what most of our listeners probably think providence is about. And that is with regard to what the Thomists would call second act. So what we've been speaking about up until now is with regard to being and existence. That's first act, the act of existence. Now we can talk about providence with regard to second act, namely operations, what beings do. So I exist in my being as God knows a human person to exist because I have a human nature. However, my operations, my actions, my human living bodily actions that I do follow from my nature and my existence. So that's why this is called first act, the act of existence. This is called second act, operations. And Thomists here recognize that if God's knowledge and order and causality is absolutely critical to establishing our active existence and our nature, so also is God's knowledge and order absolutely essential and critical, and causality is absolutely essential and critical to our operations. Why is that? It's because the being that exists operates. And if God's causality and knowledge are important in my being and existence, necessarily they must also be important with my operations, my actions, my activities. So to summarize then, Thomism places a radical emphasis on the fact that God's causality and knowledge permeate all of created reality. First act, existence, nature, what kind of being we are, and also second act, operation, activity. And in the final 30 seconds, I would just offer this. Because God is the creator, the author of all things that are, insofar as they're good, of course, nothing can be other than God unless God creates it. And therefore, things like my existence, of course, the tree, of course, but even human freedom have to be created in some way. So Thomists maintain the fact that God is 100% the cause of my free actions that are good, and I am 100% the cause also of my free actions. This is true because, unlike the Molinists, Thomists would say that God and man are not in the same level of being. God is first cause, supreme cause, a completely different order of being, and therefore of causality. We are not, as creatures, on the same plane of existence as God. So God, on this model of existence, if he is 99.999% of causal importance, then the amount of causality of God increases, results in the amount of my causality decreasing. Thomists say that's a metaphysical mistake, because God and creatures are essentially different, not just different in degree. Therefore, God, 100% as first cause, causes, holds in existence all things, and therefore we can have two 100% involved in every free action, because they're two different types of being. So to summarize, with regard to the question of predestination, divine grace, with regard to the heavenly beatitude, I am only able to freely know and love God in a supernatural way because God has caused me to know and to love him freely. If human freedom is true freedom and it's truly human, then it's creaturely, because I'm a creature, and everything creaturely has to have some origination in the good first cause. So that's a slightly desultory, scattered presentation of the Thomis's thoughts about these things, but that's how I would do it. So,
Okay, thank you so much. As I understand, the crucial question is about causality, but maybe Ryan has different comments, so you're free to ask questions or give some comments. What do you think?
Yeah, so I'm trying to understand this idea of different planes of existence, because I can understand metaphorically how that works, but when it comes down to like the actual metaphysics, I've never been able to understand how it works, and nor have I ever been able to understand the claim that, like, on Thomism, but not on other views, God's different in kind, not degree, and other views like he's only different in degree. Like I think all this is false, but like, so I'm trying to understand like what's the claim here. So could maybe help the audience out too.
sure. Thank you for that, Dr. Mullins. So I would say that it comes down to the first principles of being and reality, which are the principles of potency and act. And so when we mean that God is different in kind, not just degree, what we're saying is, you know very well, even if it appears inconsistent or unintelligible, is that God isn't just the dial of being turned up beyond kind of full blast, but they're two different dials, so to speak. And by that, the only way we can posit distinctions of being are by some type of limitation. Limitation refers to something being what it is, but also not what it is not. And so with regard to limitation, that implies potency, capacity, because by definition, a limitation is not actual. It's less perfect than act. And so when we look at created reality, the only way we can distinguish beings in the order of nature in created reality are by different configurations or degrees of potency and act. Potency is the principle that receives and limits act as a principle. In God, however, God is infinite act, which means there is no potency. And so the moment, then, this is to answer your, or to accept your kind invitation to clarify, when you have God who is infinite act, no potency, no limitation, no unactualized, unrealized capacities, pure act, he whose essence and existence are identical. And then on the other hand, you have many creatures, the order of creation in which potency and act are conjoined. You have to have a different type of being. And anytime potency comes into being, it makes it different from pure act. And in fact, different degrees and configurations of potency distinguish one type of potency act being from another. But please, I welcome your critique and that's just kind of laying out the...
Yeah. And that's what we need for the audience as well, so they can understand what on earth are these guys talking about, you know? I mean, yeah. So I mean, I personally reject divine simplicity because I do think it's unintelligible, but I know like Molina and a lot of other Molinists will say, yeah, sounds great to me. So which is where I'll disagree with Molina. So I'm trying to figure out then, like, why would the Molinist in particular have to say, well, God is just different in degree instead of different in kind? Assuming, you know, that simplicity is coherent.
So I think that they would have to say this because what they're concerned about is that if God's causality if God causes freedom, the Molinist finds the idea of a per se caused freedom unintelligible, because if it's caused, then it can't be free.
Mhm.
And so that's where you have that same plane, that God as cause and me as cause are on the same plane, and we can't share that. So if God is cause, that means he's kind of taken the cause token, and all I can have is the effect token. But to freely do something means that I have to myself participate in, receive, or take the cause token. That's why. But on the Thomist plane, where there are two different types of beings, God is pure act, I is a created, contingent, potency act, composite being, there's no necessity there, or there's no mutual exclusivity, because everything that exists on the contingent subordinate plane is caused in its very existence, and therefore in its operation. And in fact, God has to cause my freedom, or it couldn't exist. So what the Thomist is, we would never say this publicly, and I know I'm saying it on probably the internet, but what we're deep down concerned about is that Molinism would basically lead to the deification and the ontological metaphysical independence of the human person. Are you saying, Molina, or your disciples, Molinists, that there is such a thing as good, real being, free human action, good, real, that aren't from God? And these are real, yeah. Do they come from God? No, they come from me. So if they're not from God and they're real, where are they from? Because it almost sounds like now we're creating a bunch of... That's what's in the background,
right,
in the mind of the Thomist.
That's good. So I want to push back on this one more time before I'll give my own take on this. So Molina has this view that I find really weird, where he's like, I want to have the concurrence. I really want to have like all this stuff where God's like causing all these things, but I don't like the idea of God causing me to cause stuff, like exactly like you laid out. But what if instead, and Scotus does this too, what if God like causes the effects of my action? So like my action wouldn't be efficacious without God, but God causes the effect to come about. Would that satisfy you that they've got some kind of meaningful distinction between God and the creature in this way?
So it's a very interesting proposal that Molina and et alia might propose. And the Thomists would understand and appreciate that attempt to bridge the gap, so to speak. But the other thing the Thomists would still ask is, but we still have an action. So all we've done is separated action and effect, cause and effect. So I cause the action, but God does the effect. But is this action still real? So in other words, the Thomist doesn't feel like it really solves the problem, because if this is still real and reality is good, it has some goodness that would seemingly not fall under divine causality. And if you have goodness that's not under divine causality, that would seem to say God isn't God. But so that's what a Thomist's gut instinct would say.
Okay.
But please hit me. I'm ready for your vigorous.
So here's my own take on these things. So when I look at the creator-creature distinction, I think it's very easy to maintain, and there's a lot of different metaphysical systems you could use to do it. But the main thing you need is that there's this necessarily existent, ase, self-sufficient being with all the omnis. It's eternal, and that's what it means to be the creator. Is that like this sort of being, this divine being, is the single ultimate foundation of reality that's perfect. And then to be a creator means you freely cause some contingent stuff to exist. And I'm like, well, that's pretty simple. I could throw in some act and potency in there if I wanted to. If I'm like more like Platonic, I don't have to do the act and potency. I just need this idea that there is this being that is absolutely perfect and is the single ultimate foundation of reality. And then what it means to be a creator or to be a creature is just be caused to exist by that sort of being. Now from there, I've got God has all the perfections, is the source of all the perfections, and the only reason any contingent stuff exists is because God's freely brought it about. What does God freely bring about? Well, I think God's got a lot of options. He could create an open universe if he wanted to. He could create a fully deterministic universe if he wanted to. And if Molinism is coherent, which I know is a big if it is coherent, that's one of the options too. And since I want to defend the Molinist view today, say like, well, he's created this Molinist universe where there's a settled timeline. And so I'm like, where exactly am I getting that God's only different in degree? Because it's not like God's just like, he's just way more powerful than me, which is true. But he's also like the source of all power. It's not that he's just like way more smarter than me, which is true. But he's also like the source of all wisdom on this view. And so I'm like, I've got a difference in kind, because there's a kind of thing that God is, which is divine. And there's a kind of thing I am, which is human. And there's a clear meaning of what it means to be a creature, which is freely caused to exist by God. And I'm like, I don't have that. And none of these things are degreed properties, because I don't know what it means to like be like caused to exist by God and that come in degrees. Like God's like, I'll cause you a little bit more than this other guy over here. Like that doesn't. So I feel like I've got a nice clear distinction then between creator and creature. And I'll pause there because I want to talk about the levels of reality in a second. But what do you think of this?
So if I know you're graciously appropriating the side of the Molinists a little bit, although you have some sympathies, you're not fully so.
Right. Yeah.
If I heard, so to speak about a third party, let's say that the Molinists are there cheering, being like, yeah, well done.
Yeah.
I would say then, if that's true, and this is not just a difference of degree, but a difference in kind, and the real distinction between creator and creature is absolutely maintained, then why is the idea of a created freedom inimical or troubling? That would be my.
Can you spell that out a little bit more with the created freedom?
So I would say that, at least for the Thomists, if God and creatures are essentially different, not just a different in degree, but in kind, then there's never any competition. In fact, it's impossible for God and the creature to be in competition, because this is slightly metaphorical, but different types of categories almost. Mm-hmm. And yet these categories can correspond. God is the creator of created reality, even though he is not himself created. So that's why the Thomists can say with a straight face, and in fact, we think this has to be the case, God is 100% the cause of me saying, Jesus, I love you. And I am also 100% the cause of me saying, Jesus, I love you. Because the act of saying, Jesus, I love you, is both from God as first cause and me as from second cause, because we're radically different. For a Molinist, they're hesitant to say that there can be such a reality as a caused freedom. Mm-hmm. And so that's where the Thomist sees, well, it seems like you've moved from God and us a real distinction to this, because if this is the plane, then it would make sense that if God is the cause, I am losing causal priority. And if I gain causal priority, I am more the cause than God is less the cause. So that sliding scale in our ears mm-hmm. sounds like we've subtly compromised, or at least there's some ambiguity about the creator-creature distinction. Does that make sense?
It does, almost. So this is what I think we need to, this is what we need to clear up for the audience, because I knew this levels of reality is going to be a big sticking point. So any sort of like objections we want to talk about for each view, like if we can't clear this up for the audience, then I don't think we're going to do a good job. So we need to clear this up for the audience. So when I'm looking at this claim of different levels of reality, I'm looking at like not just Thomists, but also Calvinists and like lots of other like groups that say these kind of things. And so sometimes it sounds like if God and creatures are on the same level of reality, then that just means like God is like subject to like the laws of nature. So I see that a lot in the science religion dialogue, and I'm like, he's the thing that created the laws of nature. So how did I get there? And I don't see any I've never been able to find the argument for how you got there. I just see the assertion. And so I'm assuming you're not doing something like that. No. Okay, good. So we can rule that out and say the science religion dialogue, come again another day when you got an argument. Another group, sometimes I'll see this. It's like I remember having a conversation with Rowan Williams about this, and he was very clear when he clarified this for me. Is when we talk about different levels of reality, what we're saying is God's the one that causes all these things. And because God's impassible, like there's no causal influence back on God. And I feel like that's going to be part of the story for the Thomists, because they're happy with impassibility. Be like, yeah, that's good. So I've got impassibility as part of the story. So God's this doctrine of like universal divine causality. God's causing everything. And I have no causal influence on God. And then it's, in some sense, it's compatible, that human freedom is compatible being causally determined by God. And I'm like, if that's it, then this whole talk of levels of this levels metaphor it's just a metaphor. We can throw it away and go, okay, so the real issues are, is God impassible or not? Is that coherent? And then is this idea of human freedom being compatible with being divinely determined, is that coherent? So we don't need the levels talk anymore. We know exactly what we're saying. Is that?
Yeah, thank you. For the sake of argument, I'm willing to go down that path. I would just ask this. We don't have to dwell on it.
Sure.
Would not God's impassibility originate from a difference in what we're calling, in our conversation, the levels of being? Because we don't meet any other kind of being that is impassible. Would that not seem to gesture towards essentially different kind of being? Or
if impassible, well, yeah, but I also think that if impassibility is false, it still wouldn't be like, well, therefore this being's not God, because it would be, well, this being is able to be influenced by rational considerations outside of himself. And I'm like,
so that's funny. The Thomists would have a heart attack. I know you. That's I know.
Like,
no. An impassible God is, or a passible God is a contradiction. But I see what you're saying.
Yeah, because so as I see it, there is, when I'm looking at a lot of these theological debates, there are certain like uncontested divine attributes that most models of God agree on. And so they all affirm this sort of core concept of whatever it is to be God is this perfect being that's the single ultimate foundation of reality. And then now we're spelling out, okay, what does it mean to be perfect? And the Thomist is going to be like impassibility, simplicity, timelessness, immutability. And others are going to go, meh, eternality, like that's great, without beginning, without end, but like do one thing and then another. Is he like fully immutable in all ways? Well, no, because then he couldn't like do something new, like create a universe or become incarnate. Is he passible? Well, yeah, like because he's going to be perfectly rational. And part of it, what it means to be perfectly rational is to be responsive to reasons. And when you create a universe, I would think that stuff you create has value, and those give you reasons to act in various ways. And so I'm like, I still got this nice, neat distinction between God, that thing that's the ultimate foundation of reality, and all the created stuff, all without these more contested attributes of like simplicity or timelessness or impassibility. That's kind of how I'm seeing it. But I know like not all Thomists are happy with that. But
I appreciate your very clear thinking and articulation, and not to dwell on it, but that's because that's very interesting. Two questions or one point and then a question is, the point for the Thomists is God is pure act, explains immutability, impassibility, eternality. So they're not all, it isn't like God is perfect because of the ims or the omnis, as you said earlier.
Yeah.
It's because of pure act is perfection. That's the ultimate principle. Pure act, and then creatures are composites of potency and act. So just to give a hierarchy to the perfect, it's pure act, that is perfection. But then my question is, so sure, if we're going to say God is passible, and to be rational is to be influenced or shaped by the goods that are in creation. My question is, well, doesn't that beg the question in the sense that creatures only receive the aspects under which they'd be desirable to God, if God were passible, from God?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's
so part of the story. Are you saying he pays himself then? He imparts it to the creature and then takes it from the creature, like their goodness relates to them in this way?
Sort of. It's
okay.
It's so the idea would be the doctrine of divine ideas that you laid out earlier. So God would be going, here's all these divine ideas, all these things I could possibly create, and they are valuable. Like there's a different kind of value that would not exist if I did not create this thing. So you talked about the divine idea of like a tree or a rock or a human, and then even I would think like divine ideas of like particulars of each of those, right? Because you're not wanting to go like with like Avicenna, where like, is God no particulars? Or yeah, right. So you want these really particulars, like he's like that human being, not just any human, but that one. I want that one. There's a kind of value there that I, as God, would not have if I did not bring this thing into existence. And that's the claim that I want to make. It's not a very classical claim, but that's the claim I want to make. And I think that's part of what passibility is wanting to say, is there are certain kinds of considerations that God says, this is not just my own nature that I'm considering. There are things that if they come to exist, which I'm the only one who can bring it about, but if they come to exist, they're going to have a genuine kind of value that would not obtain otherwise. And so that's something for me to react to, respond to that, a reason for me to act.
Okay, that's interesting. It's very mysterious for a Thomist, which sure. I know you know. Yeah. But no, I appreciate your clarity, because my first thought is as well, to react to anything It's like when there's just God,
Right.
where is the thing that he reacts to, even in the idea? Because that idea is still the divine being.
Yeah. So
So reacting to self is peculiar. Go ahead.
It's reacting to self in a particular way, and this is a puzzle that bothers me. This is like a separate issue, but it's one that relates to providence. Is this the general problem of creation? Like, why would God create anything at all? And what I see in a lot of different thinkers is they'll go, well, God's own goodness. And I'm like, he's already got that. That's not a reason to create. Well, his own glory, because Calvinists, they love to talk about glory. They won't tell you what it is, but like, glory. And you're like, cool, glory. And I'm like, well, he's already got all glory. And they're like, yeah, that's right. And I'm like, well, that's not a reason to create. And it can't be, like me, particularly because I'm not around yet. I can't be like, God, you got to create me. So it's going to have to be him seeing the potential value of his own ideas, and that they would have a value, a different kind of value, if you brought them into being. So I think that's part of the story we have to tell in order to get a coherent answer to the general problem of creation. And then from there, then you start developing your doctrine of providence. And God's like, these are the kind of values that would exist if I were to create. Here's how I would respond to them. Now, your average Calvinist is not going to like that, because even like these considerations of like potential values, they think that's going to violate impassibility. I don't know how the Thomist is going to talk about this. I don't know if that's going to sound like a violation of impassibility. But for a Calvinist, they're like, that sounds like Arminianism. That sounds like that dirty Molinism those Catholics were doing. This is awful. This is the way they'll kind of talk sometimes. So I don't know how that sounds to a Thomist though. But so go ahead.
Yeah, Thomists, we don't like Molinism and Arminianism, and basically anything that would imply what the Thomists were Aristotelians would call passive potency. Anytime God is different, that's a problem.
Right.
Because difference means there's change, and change means there's potency that's actualized, potencies that weren't actualized that now are actualized. And so here's the thing, even for freedom, for the Thomists, freedom always is a sign of imperfection, even in God.
Wait,
so that's why. Again? Yeah, I know. See, I knew that would catch your attention. Right. So just to say this, so let's just start with the human creature. So I am free to sit or stand right now, which means that bespeaks an imperfection, namely that I haven't actualized the goods of standing or of sitting. When I'm doing the opposite, I have to do one or the other. Freedom, contingency, variability bespeaks imperfection. So God is perfect. There is no potency. There's no imperfection. God is pure act. So properly speaking, God is not free within himself. He just is God. But yet, God freely creates. So are we not in a contradiction then? Because you say on the one hand, pure act being can't have any imperfection, because imperfection requires potency. There's no potency in God, and yet it is divinely revealed, an article of the faith, that God freedom, and therefore imperfection, chose to create. The Thomists will say, oh yeah, no, imperfection's there, but it's not in God, it's in the side of creation. That's the locus, the place, the subject of imperfection, because there you have potency. And so that's with regard to divine simplicity and immutability and impassibility. All free actions, even those of God, require some imperfection. It's just none of the imperfections reside in God. They all reside in the potential potency, the capacities, the principles on the side of creation, whether to create or to redeem. So what the Thomist thinks, and I'll stop here and welcome your critiques, is that we want to make things that God does more real by inserting motion rather than act into God. And motion bespeaks. Motion is the activation of a potency insofar as it's in potency. And that's why we can say there can be no motion in God. And so we want to say to the Molinists, or to those that would deny not that the Molinists do always, but deny that the simplicity of God is, you can have the simplicity, the perfection of God, and you don't have to have motion. And in fact, the term of motion is act. God doesn't need to move, to be moved, because he's already at the destination. So God doesn't need to be free in himself. because he's already God. There's nothing for him to grasp that he doesn't have or doesn't come from him. Rather, the freedom and goodness that God shares with the world, that comes from the side of creation. So again, please, I don't wish to go on and on.
No, so does God have the perfection of? So wait, hang on. It sounds like freedom's not a perfection at all, and so this is something we should not predicate of God.
That's what the Thomists would say, sure.
Okay, but then when it comes to
not an absolute perfection, sure.
Okay, so it's like some kind of like relative.
So so God, the fact that God made us and that He freely made us, that is a perfection in a sense, as you say. It's good that the creature exists. It's according to His, but it's not something that changed His intrinsic being.
So if I am engaged in like perfect being theology in order to try to like discern what God's like, I would go, okay, well, what are the great making properties? These properties that are better to have than not have. And like freedom's usually on the list of like, man, it's better to have freedom than not have freedom, because like that rock over there, it has no free will. What is that? And then I'm in Philadelphia at the moment. I'm like just 2 blocks away from the Avenue of Freedom, So like the most American thing I could say is freedom's a perfection, right? So like it really is. They call it the Avenue of Freedom right next to Independence Hall. And so if I'm doing like my perfect being theology, it seems like I should go, well, okay, so this seems like the attribute that God should have. But then the Thomist is going to come along and go, you made a mistake somewhere in your thinking of perfect being theology. And in the mistake I'm making, so correct me if I'm wrong, the mistake I'm making is I'm not considering this metaphysical principle about potency always being an imperfection.
Exactly.
Okay.
And so I would say that we would say, I would say that I love them. I read them. My hobby is reading modern philosophers and enjoying them and thinking, but like the idea that freedom is a perfection, I would say that's indicative of modern philosophy more than classical.
Oh, really?
Because, I would say that because here's the thing. Now, in terms of an absolute perfection, because again, the Thomists would say, let's say on the level of absolutes, like almost transcendental freedom, how could that be a perfection? Because to be free means something could do A or B, and if it can do A and not B, that means it doesn't yet have A or B because it can do both. Mm-hmm. So that bespeaks imperfection. So we see written into freedom and its variability an essential, necessary per se imperfection. Mm-hmm. Just because there's options, and if there's options, you don't have all the options already. And so this is why in heaven there's no free will. In terms of no one will ever check out of heaven like they check out of a hotel. Like, God, you've been great, but I'm going to go check out, the Avenue of Freedom or something like that. It's because God is so infinitely good. There's no other option. There's no other good that could pull me away.
I mean, you're in DC right now. You're saying the most un-American things, that freedom's not like. So, but this is good because this shows highlights, I think, a key difference where you and I are thinking, because I want to say freedom is definitely going to be an absolute perfection, like the ability to do A or not A and to be the source of your rational actions, like that. I want to say is a perfection. So I guess what I would be doing then is several things. One, I'd be rejecting the idea that potency is always a limit or a lack or an imperfection. I would have that intuition anyway. And then saying, this method of perfect being theology I was doing before, I'm not going to have a principle like that that's going to make me go, ooh, let's get rid of freedom. But then I'm also worried about how we're going to account for creation ex nihilo, because it is an article of the faith that we say God did not have to create this particular universe. He could have created a different one. And he didn't have to create it all. He could have been like, oh, all these universes are terrible. I'm not doing that. Like this. So how do we explain that article of faith on the Thomist view?
So good. And thank you for that. Just one clarification. So for the audience, the 3 first principles are potency, which receives and limits act. Potency is an imperfection, but it's not evil. It's not bad. It's imperfect, but it's not bad. Privation is disorder, disactivation. So just to remind our listeners that it's not only potency and act, but also there's a 3rd principle, which is privation. So even though something is imperfect, that doesn't mean it's evil. Something can be good and imperfect, like you and I are good, but we could be better. So just a good. But so thank you. Thank you for your. I with regard to the article that God freely created, I would just say that yes, God did freely create, but freely create, that's a category predicated off of creation in relation to God. Namely, God is not eternally creator. which is an article of the faith, even though Aquinas and others have said by reason alone we couldn't demonstrate that God hadn't always created, but we know by faith that God didn't always create. And so if God didn't always create, that can't be an essential property of God, namely God as creator is not in God. So therefore, the freedom to create resides in creation, and that's in the potency that's present in the created order.
I want you to repeat that sentence, because it sounded like you said the freedom to create is in creation, and that sounded wrong to me because creation
God
doesn't
is free.
exist. You're right. Yes, God's supposed to be the free one. So did I hear that right?
You did. And so I would just clarify that God, this is where we come back to the fact that God is not really related to creatures, but creatures are really related to God. And all that means is that, this back to impassibility, that creatures in no way, nor can they in any way, change pure act, because pure act is unchangeable because it's already actualized. So when I said that the freedom, the imperfection, which is the ground of freedom, resides in creatures. We can say God freely creates, but the emphasis there is on creation. And the freedom characteristic property, that is only God creating something which is not purely perfect. So in other words, we can speak about God freely creating, but the ground and foundation of that freedom is the imperfection of creatures. Which is to say, anything God does outside of himself is absolutely free, because anything he creates or does outside of himself is not himself. And if he's pure act, and what's outside of him is not pure act because it's not God, then it has to have potency and act. And if you have potency, then you have freedom. But please.
So is there an intentionality on God's part to select this universe instead of another one?
An intentionality, you mean a deliberateness or
preference? Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, sure. The divine wisdom. Yeah.
Because what I'm struggling to figure out how, if you don't have freedom as a perfection, and I still don't understand exactly how like God's freely creating the universe on this view, but it's still the case that God wants this universe instead of a different one.
Sure.
And is that
he wants it because of himself?
Because of himself. Can you explain that a little bit?
So that God's knowledge and love are such that he knows, as you said, he knows all the possible worlds he could have created. And he sees how his goodness could have been manifest in all of those possible worlds, which would be created goodnesses. But he has ordained that this world would be not just possible, but actual. So in other words, it all comes down to, if we think of it like this, the Thomist always wants to come back to God as first and foremost. And we can't look for any other origin of goodness or truth or order except from God himself. So it's not like, and I know you're not saying this, but the Thomist has an allergy to God as the Walmart shopper model. Mm-hmm. It's like, we got possible world one. Well, that might look nice next to the Christmas tree. Or possible world number two. Well, that could go in the front yard. And then let's see. No, there's nothing out there. It's all reflective. All the possible worlds, ideas of what he could do come from him. And if they come from him, then they are essentially are reflective of him and his goodness. And then we're back to the divine goodness, infinite good, infinite truth, etc.
Right. Yeah. So to clarify for the audience, so you still have possible world semantics. You can do all that kind of fun stuff. But what you're saying is the source of these possibilities is God himself. It's not like he just walks around and finds himself like, oh, there's some worlds over there I could do. Like it's in right. Yeah. Yeah, and I like that too. I mean, I want to agree with that. I want to ground everything in the divine ideas. I feel like we should get into a bit more Providence like sounding stuff though for everybody. So we've talked a bit about going back to the levels of reality thing. So I had suggested we could get rid of all this talk of levels of reality, because what it really comes down to is God is the impassible causal source of everything that happens. And I have freedom, but it's somehow compatible with or consistent with God causing my free actions.
And it has to be, because is there something that's not good that's not caused by God?
Right. And so that's the claim, right? So let's get into that a bit, so we can talk about if these different views are coherent. So your average Molinist is going to go, okay, hang on. So I'm caused like to exist by God. That's fine, and I'm caused to have the causal powers I have by God. That sounds cool. And God, I want to say like God's like, I'm going to trust these creatures to do stuff, some kind of actions with their causal powers. But then the Thomists is like, yep. Well, there's a little bit more to the story though. Like God's going to cause you to have these certain desires that you have, because those have a positive ontological status. God's causing your mental states. He's causing your intentions, and he's causing your actions. And at that point, the Molinist is going to go, well, now I don't know. I don't even know what it means for me to have causal power, full stop. And so how am I even getting causal power on this story? And then how am I even going to get free will? So tell me how I get causal power on this story, because it looks like occasionalism to me.
Sure. So the first way we get causal power is if my creaturely causality and causal power is real, then it has to be created, unless it's God. Mm-hmm. So that's the first. So that's like checking the answer in the back of the book. If I am a creature, and therefore my causal power is also creaturely because it's mine, then it has to be in some way created. So that's the first step. The second step would be is that this is where the degrees of being, the different types of being is significant, because if God and I are in completely different ontological being planes, then when I say God causes me and I cause myself, there is no competition, no negation, no tension. So if we let's say that even the Thomist and the Molinist are watching a free act, and they have metaphysical glasses on, so they're seeing divine causality and all these things. So and afterwards there's a test passed around, and it says, did the man, and let's say that the free action is throwing a frisbee, and the Thomist takes the test, and the first question is, okay, you watched metaphysically through your metaphysical glasses this man freely throwing a frisbee. Question 1, did the man freely throw the frisbee of himself? Yeah. Yes. Thomist would say yes. Second question, did the man throw the frisbee because of God's causality? Of God? Yes. The Molinist, the Thomist, wonders if he would be able to answer in the same way. So in other words, let me try one more other tack approach. It's impossible for God's causality to replace mine, and it's impossible for my causality to exist without God's causality, because if God were to cause me to do something and it's truly me, and I am a causal being, in order for what God causes in me, my action, to be truly mine, it has to participate in my freedom. So the idea for a Thomist that God could do violence to the will is unintelligible. God as a cause causing me as a creature assumes and fully what kind of being I am. Does that make sense a little bit?
No, because I've got the metaphor of the levels again, but I wanted to get away from the metaphor. I wanted to, so the issue is the levels, all it's telling me is that human freedom and divine causation, they're compatible. And so I want to know, how are they compatible? Because so let me try the objection slightly differently. So I've got this objection of that's not in print yet, but it's coming out soon. It's I can't believe it's not occasionalism. So, think of I can't believe it's not butter kind of thing. And so that already alienates us from most of the audience, because all the younger people are like, what on earth is I can't believe it's not butter? So here's the idea. So occasionalism, you see this in a lot of Islamic thinkers who affirm divine simplicity and this act potency distinction, all this kind of stuff. And so occasionalism is the view that God is the only causal agent that exists, full stop. Nobody else has any causal power at all. And these occasionalists, they affirm the doctrine of universal divine causality. And so they'll say God's causing all the things. He's causing you to exist. He's causing your mental states, your intentions, your desires. He's causing your actions. He's causing it all. He's the only causal agent. And then the Thomist comes along and says, well, God, there's a difference between us and the occasionalist. We want to say that God didn't like God actually gave you genuine causal power somehow, and God's concurring with your actions. But when I look at the underlying story, I'm like, okay, so the occasionalist tells me, why did I perform the action that I did? Well, because God caused me to do it. And why did I want to do that? Well, because God caused my desire and he caused my intention to do all that. And that's why God's the only causal agent. I'm like, okay, cool. And then what does the doctrine of concurrence say? The doctrine of concurrence says, well, God gave you genuine causal power. And the reason you act the way that you did is because God directly caused you to do that. The reason you wanted to do it is because, well, he caused you to like want those acts, to do those things. And he caused your mental states. And I'm like, this sounds exactly like the occasionalist view. So I'm trying to figure out what exactly is the occasionalist difference between occasionalism and a concurrence view, because it can't just simply be like stomping your foot on the ground saying, well, he gave you genuine causal power and you really are performing this action. It's because the occasionalist is like, well, yeah, like God's causing you to do that. And the concurrence is going, yeah, he caused you to do that. I'm like, where's the difference here? Because it doesn't sound like I have any causal power here.
What is the essential attribute of causal power in the question that you're asking?
Yeah, so I want to say there actually are these properties that are powers that agents can actually perform. And so on my view, what I would say is God creates a universe, creates beings with certain natures, and part of what that package of what it is in nature is different kinds of powers, different kinds of properties. And then God just sustains them. It's a mere conservation sort of view. And sustains them in existence, and allows them to exercise those powers as they see fit. And they'll react and respond, and every once in a while perform some miracles. So it's not like deism or anything like that. It really is trying to get you the full Christian story of resurrection and answering prayers. But there's actual causal powers, and God doesn't need to cause you to cause your powers. He just needs to keep you in existence, and that's it. So that's what I'm thinking here. It's like a genuine power that these creatures have.
Okay. And the Thomists would agree with the words in the sense that we also want to maintain that they're authentic causal powers. We would just say that that's impossible for God to maintain causal powers and for them to do anything unless God is also. So in other words, that's why in the first part, as you as your listeners know, I spoke about first act and second act, that what you're saying is God sustains us in being first act, but we are responsible ultimately for our own, exclusively even, because we also say we're responsible for our actions, but and the Thomists would say God's causality has to reach into both existence and operation. If I may, then how do we account for the fact that so God holds person one in existence and person two in existence, and person one acts in this way and person two acts in a completely different way? Obviously, we're going to reduce to the principial level the reason why those are different actions to the persons, the creature's choices. But when it comes to predestination and providence, particularly if both hear the gospel, for example, some supernatural good, how do we, without coming back to kind of a naturalism where one is smarter or one is just more well-natured kind of naturally, what accounts for someone kind of, two people are at the same Billy Graham crusade, one hears Jesus and responds, the other doesn't. How would we parse that?
Yeah, so as I want to make sure I'm getting the question clear. So is it you're thinking in terms of before God creates, and he's trying to figure out predestining some to salvation and others, or foreknowing that others are going to go to damnation, however you want to put it. That like the point that you're curious about?
Or yes, ultimately in the background, but even just concretely, like we're watching person one kind of go forward and make an act of faith, and person two is not. So yeah, I still don't know if God's real or Jesus is my savior.
Yeah, I don't have the doctrine of grace fully figured out. So the denominational background that I have is so bare bones Christianity that we're like, yeah, there's grace. And I'm like, but what is it? And they're like, yeah, there's some grace. I'm like, okay, cool. So like, so I've got these a lot of these things in my theology. I'm like, I want more. I'm trying to look at other accounts, and I don't like a lot of them, because on some accounts it looks like it's just God going, grace for you, not for this other guy over here. And I'm like, so God could have saved everyone, but it just didn't give so sort of grace over here for reasons I don't really understand. That doesn't seem fully rational to me. if God's goal is to enter into friendship with humanity. So there's this other account of grace that you'll see some Molinist in the Protestant traditions, and some Calvinists will do too. It's this idea called congruentism. Let's see if I can articulate this well. So prior to creation, God's looking at, here's all the possible creatures I could create. And the amount of grace that I give to all these different creatures, it cannot be a violent or manipulative grace. This is the way some of the Calvinists will talk sometimes, because they really want it to be like, you've got freedom. And if it's manipulative, like, it sounds horrible to say God gave you this like violent manipulative grace. So that's not good. So God figures out the exact degree of grace that would persuade you to follow Christ, that where you're still able to be free in a way that doesn't actually manipulate you or override your freedom. And so that's supposed to explain why there might be some cases over here of these different people where the kind of grace would be needed to give them at this point in their life to follow Christ, it would turn violent or manipulative. And so God has good reasons not to be violent or manipulative. So this other person over here, though, goes to the Billy Graham conference, and I've been one of these, by the way, when I was a kid. And he's just moved by what Billy Graham's saying, because the kind of grace that God is able to offer in that case would not be violent or manipulative. Even though personally, when I was at the Billy Graham conference, some of it felt very bathos, the kind of like emotional manipulation that was going on. So it's like, this might be in the range of like the manipulation stuff, but that's kind of the idea is on congruentism. But I don't know if it works though. I really don't. So yeah, so maybe, I don't know, tell you what you think about that, and then tell me about the account of grace that Thomists would give.
So with regard to, so what a Thomist, the alternative in the Thomist mind, the alternative to the Thomist position, we think ends up in determinism. So ironically, the Thomist teaching that God causes good, free actions, and the human is caused to cause themselves to act good and free, well and free. We think that's the only way we can guarantee real freedom. Because if grace is in any way extrinsic in its ultimate referent, of course, there are extrinsic graces. Driving by a church, that's a graced experience. It's outside of me. Mm-hmm. But in its ultimate referent, and so that's why the Molinist, or the Thomist, thinks that the Molinist ends up in determinism. Mm-hmm. Because if God looks through the corridor of time and sees that, there's, Dr. Mullins and Father Cuddy. And if I put Dr. Mullins in this possible world with these people, he'll respond to the gospel. And if I put him in this other possible world, he'll think Billy Graham is a great manipulator and doing, I'm leaning back and doing all these things. And I want him not to be manipulated. So I'm going to put him in here, knowing how he will respond to these external circumstances. The Thomist says, actually, I know, Molina, what you're trying to do. But in the end, he's now set up. Because these circumstances will always result in him doing what God eternally foreknew. Mm-hmm. The Thomists would say, on the other hand, that God has ordained to activate your freedom or my freedom in this way or that way. He has ordained to cause me to freely cause myself. That doesn't render me determined, because freedom, again, comes down to potency. So here's the thing, and if I may, I'll just try to say it briefly. But the Thomist view of free, we can there's the Thomists divided into the composite and the divided senses of freedom. My students here always roll their eyes because this can kind of be a bit elusive. But the example that the Thomists use is sitting. So you and I are both seated. So we would say right now, you and I are sitting, but we are also free not to sit. Because at any moment, we could actualize our potency, our power, our capacity to stand. So I am sitting, but I am free to stand. And in fact, I am even free to stand while I am sitting. That's the nature of freedom. That's what Thomas want to point. That's the way freedom is. He says, however, that's the divided sense of freedom. Namely, while doing one thing, activating your power in one way, the power of sitting, I could activate it in another way, stand. Humans are not only sitting creatures, nor are they always standing creatures. But what Thomas would want to say is that freedom is not in the composite sense, namely, I am free to stand while sitting, or if I'm standing, I'm free to sit while standing. What I'm not free to do is to sit and stand at the same time in the same respect. So the Thomist says, when God freely ordains from all eternity that on this date, August 12th, at this time, you and I will say, Jesus, I love you, and that's a supernatural act. Are we 100% going to do that? Yeah, because God has ordained it. But is it also 100% free? Yes, because even while saying, Jesus, I love you, I am still the type of being that could say something else or not say that. So what Thomists think basically is that Molinists have erected an impossible definition of freedom. Namely, I can only be free if I am in the composite sense of being moved by God and not being moved by God.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Thomists want to remind us that freedom resides in potency. So even while I am being moved by God to say, Jesus, I love you, I'm still free because my nature is still the kind of being that could say something else. Just like while I'm sitting, I am still free to stand even though I'm sitting. Does that at all?
I mean, I struggled to figure out if it's actually intelligible, but I understand like the claims at least. Yeah. So I've got the claim that I'm being caused to respond to God, and I don't understand how that's free because it's caused by something other than me. And I mean,
So
I know you'd be like,
uncaused
well,
freedom.
yeah, it's a cause freedom. I'm like, I don't know if that makes sense.
Okay.
Whereas I know the Molinist, well, okay, my version of Molinism is going to go, we got to get away from concurrence entirely because like it's just not intelligible. But like Molina is going to be like, yeah, like there really is this sense in which you could do otherwise, but your act's not going to be efficacious. And I'm like, I don't know what you're saying. That sounds unintelligible to me, Molina. And so I've got the same kind of worries here. So what it looks like from what you're saying is like on the Molinist view, there's entrapment. So that's why I'm not free, right? Whereas I'm going, okay, it does kind of look like entrapment. It really does. But on the Thomist view, I've got something even worse. Like I just really do have full-blown divine determinism. And the sense in which I could do otherwise is in a sense that's utterly irrelevant. So my nature is such that I could do otherwise left to its own devices. Yeah, there's a sense in which you could talk about. But on the Thomist view, there is no real meaningful sense in which my nature could be sitting there left to its own devices. Because my nature and the way it's all set up with in this Thomist scheme is I do what God causes me to do because there can't be any causes without God causing them. So I don't understand this idea of my nature being left to on its own. There's a sense in which you could do otherwise because that's supposed to be ruled out as impossible. That kind of freedom is ruled out as impossible in Thomism. So it feels like I'm talking about an irrelevant sense of my ability to do otherwise. I don't know if I said that quite.
That's
clearly.
very clear. You're a very
Okay.
clear thinker. I'm sure your students are very grateful for the clarity of your pedagogy. What would so we don't want to go into the Molinistic setup entrapment. So let's say you're the philosophical theological surgeon that's called in to fix the Thomist deterministic mess.
Mm-hmm.
What would you take out or introduce into the Thomist configuration of themes, principles, causality to fix it? Or would you say this patient's too far gone, we just got to move on?
I'm tempted to say that, but I feel like I could salvage some things.
Okay.
So I want to say this idea of act impotency, like that basic metaphysical idea seems fine to me. A lot of the baggage that would go onto it, I don't think I'm happy with. Like it was saying like certain things are imperfect or perfect based on whether or not they have act impotency. But the idea of like having a causal power, that just is a potency, right? And then I actualize it. And so I'm like, okay, this all sounds good. And the idea that my nature is such that I could cause this or that. I could manifest my power in different kinds of ways. This all sounds fine to me. So some of the basics there, I think, are salvageable. I think they're plausible. I think you can do a lot with them. It's some of these other principles that get added in that I'm like, I don't think I can go that far. And so I don't know how to help out the Thomist without getting rid of a lot of other principles that the Thomist is like, this is really essential to our whole system.
And how would you respond then to the idea that human actions could be good and have goodness because they exist, or maybe even have meritorious goodness or some type of ontic goodness, but aren't don't come from God? Is that just like it's a mediated through the God's holding us in being, and that's enough goodness for us to like make more goodness? Is that kind of
Yeah, sort of. So I like the Augustinian idea of the great chain of being. Like that sounds really cool to me, and that sounds very plausible to me. God's at the top of the chain; He's the source of the chain. I don't know how else you could like think of it otherwise. Anything that God creates has some level of goodness or some degree of goodness. Some things are more cool than others, and it's really intuitive. Like the rock example you gave earlier of like the rock, it cannot participate in God's goodness in an active way because it's a rock. Except for some geologists tell me about the evolution of rocks, and there might be some kind of active. But let's ignore the geologists for today,
okay?
Because then it gets weird. So, whereas I, as a rational agent, I can participate in God in a way in the great chain of being. I'm higher up on the chain than the rock is. So there's different kinds of things going on because the kind of thing that I am, the nature that I am, and because of the kind of thing that I am. There's certain potential goods that come along with me that I can bring about. And that's the sort of stuff I want to say. God's like, yes, I want that in the world. I want to create beings that have different degrees of goodness because I want a lot of stuff on the great chain of being. And some of these things, these rational agents, they can produce sort of actions that I want to see that will bring about certain kinds of goods that would not exist if I did not create a universe and did not create these kind of beings. So God's still the ultimate source of all these goods, but He's creating beings that can produce more kinds of goods. And that is a pretty awesome thing in of itself. And I want to say that's on the great chain of being of possible things. Free agents that can bring about goods that would not exist without them. And God's like, I want that because that's amazing. And so He's still the ultimate source in this sort of way. But He's not going to be the source of their actions in the sense of causing their actions to be. Yeah.
So then, and this is not meant to be unfair, but just to clarify, are you saying then that God is or is not, or in a nuanced way, is or is not the cause of all goodness in reality?
He would be the cause, the ultimate cause, in the sense of the first thing, they wouldn't get any goodness without Him. He's the source and the ground of all possible goods. And the only reason there are the kind of goods that you see in the world is because God created this kind of universe where these goods become possible. And He creates beings where these kinds of goods, in some cases, would be inevitable. Because as I see it, if God really does want to create a universe where He could enter into friendship with humanity, the kind of universe He's going to have to create is going to be one where humanity is inevitable. So that would be a kind of good where when He's setting up the universe, He's like, that's the universe I want. So it needs to have stable laws of nature, needs to have a certain kind of evolutionary process that goes a particular direction. And so I'm definitely going to make sure that I get these kinds of goods. And because of that, now I've got these cool little things called humans that can produce all sorts of goods that I want to see what they produce. Whereas the Molinist is going to go, I know exactly what kind of things they're going to produce. And that's partly why I set up this world the way I do, is so I can see that these goods get produced.
Oh, interesting. So you're even, I should have connected this explicitly. So you're actually saying that God can kind of, in a nuanced, let's say poetic sense, be surprised by the good creation that He chose to create.
There's a sense in which the Molinists should say this, but they don't, because, so I mentioned this in my opening statement. I didn't go into it in any detail. So the Molinist puts in all these logical moments in the timeless life of God. And at that first moment of natural knowledge, God knows His nature. He knows all the possibilities, but He doesn't know any actualities. He doesn't know what He Himself is going to do, because there are no truths about those things yet. But then at the later logical moments, He does know what's going to happen. And so what you have is, from that one timeless moment, God knows the future and He does not know the future. He knows that He Himself hasn't even decided anything, and He has decided things. And I'm like, you have got all these contradictions. I can just pile them up all day long if you want. And I'm like, this is a disaster. I mean, you don't want like a bunch of eternal contradictions at the heart of your theology, right? Well, some people do, but I'm not one of them. And so I'm like, we got to get rid of these. How do you do that? Well, you make these logical moments temporal moments. At that first moment, the future is unsettled. It really is. And God doesn't know what's going to happen because He has not decided. And so I'm like, okay, Molina, you said that. You take it back later, but let's just take it and say it. And then what happens at the next moment, when the whole world in God Himself is subsequently otherwise, when He's engaged in hypotheticals, and then the next moment after that, God's making decisions of, this is the universe I want. And so I don't have contradictions because it's not all happening at the same moment. I have a sequence of moments in the life of God. So I remove these contradictions. So the surprise would be stuck in there.
Okay.
But it doesn't sound that surprising. God's like, what am I going to do? Whoa, I didn't expect I was going to do. And I'm like, well, okay. I think you're making a rational decision. So, yeah.
But then that's where you would say that God, that's why you want to maintain some degree of passibility within God, to just have that slight, again, it's not surprise in the happy birthday. Oh, I never knew, but there can be this development. Then what is the found is, this is interesting, because the Thomist finds this, I'm sure it's when you hear me speak, you're like, I see a logic to this, but this is also fundamentally kind of very peculiar.
Yeah.
Because then how can we maintain the real distinction between creatures and the creator? Would it just be that the direction of the causality, that God started the whole thing? Is that the essence of what it means to be creator? He was the first cause, not just the highest.
Well, I think that's part of it, because again, I take the basic concept of God that all models of God seem to agree with, is that God is a perfect being, which is the single ultimate foundation of reality. Mm-hmm. And so I've got God and nothing else. And then what it means to create ex nihilo is like, there's God and nothing else. Like, there's no stuff that he draws from. He snaps his fingers and boom, there's all of this stuff. And what it means to be a creature is your existence is completely contingent on the will of God. And I'm like, okay, cool. I've got all the distinction I need. If you want more, I think those are extra metaphysical claims that you need to make. But I think at rock bottom, that's going to be the distinction between the creator and the creature.
Good. That's okay. Now, what is continuous between the creator? Let me ask you this. God before he created, God after he created, what's the same and what's different? Between God, thank you.
So I want to deny divine simplicity and affirm this very ancient view called the attributionist view. You see it in more in Islam. That's the majority of Islamic theologians affirm this, where God literally has these distinct attributes. And you see it a lot today from most Christian philosophers who reject. And then I think you see it in like some other thinkers, like perhaps Peter of Ireland, like Aquinas' teacher, because he wants to affirm like passibility and mutability and these sorts of things. If he affirms simplicity on top of that, then I'm like, well, this is an incoherent view. But, so what you'd have is God would have these essential attributes. He really would have eternality, omnipotence, omniscience, aseity, self-sufficiency, the whole bag. Those can't change because essential like attributes by definition, you can't gain or lose them. That's why they're essential. What changes is the exercise of that power. So God has this omnipotence, which I take to be this maximal set of power granting abilities. And he's got all these abilities and he can exercise them in different ways. So that's going to be a change. He's got this maximal cognitive power, the ability to know all things. What does he know? Well, that's going to change because that depends on what he's doing. Because if he's not doing anything, then he's going to know I exist all alone. If he does stuff, it would be really weird if God was like, I know I exist all alone. I'm like, well, you don't sound very like maximally great in your cognitive abilities at the moment if you can't tell the difference between I exist alone and I exist with a bunch of cosmic stuff. So when God creates a universe, his knowledge is going to change of now I'm doing things, now I'm producing a universe. So certain contingent features are going to change, and he'll acquire, I think, accidental properties. Like he wasn't always creator, then he became the creator. Wasn't always incarnate, then became incarnate. But the essential properties, those all stay the same. Yeah.
So where then does the
just to specify, because I didn't check in the moment at the beginning, how much time do we have? Because we already have 1 hour and 20 minutes. So
do we want to go to 1 hour and 30 minutes? Is that agreeable to you?
Yeah.
Both of you?
Yeah. I plan to do,
minutes.
Yeah, but we can go longer if you have time. So because I have.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I think 6 more minutes. I would love to do it again. This has been very delightful.
Sure.
But if that's okay with you, Dr. Mullins, 6 more minutes. Okay.
Was there any audience questions though? Because I know this is a weird time of day for different time zones.
We have like different questions, but I think it's like hard to grasp in 6 minutes. So
okay.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. But I think we could like in 2 minutes have some final thoughts from both of you, and we can conclude. I'm sorry that we didn't specify this in the beginning.
That's okay.
But it was great discussion, and I feel like I'm a little child that don't understand anything. Yeah, but well, it's a great joy to be with you. And just my last question to Dr. Mullins before we we allow our gracious host to guide us, would just be, where does the connection between those essential attributes which don't change and the changes that do, which seem to, would you call them accidents, accidental changes in God?
Okay. So because if God's not always creator and then he becomes creator, that's an accidental property.
Yeah.
I mean, that's why Augustine wants to say God's not really related to the universe, because he doesn't want God to have those accidents, where I go, what's the big deal? Well, why not have some accidents?
But then do those accidents exist in the essence? And then how can we say, if they do, that the essence doesn't undergo change?
The essence would, so it would be the case that God doesn't change in terms of getting new essential properties.
I see.
But if the essence just, it depends what you think essence is. If you think essence is the thing that like grounds God's essential attributes, that's fine with me. I find it mysterious, but not in a way of like, that's nuts. I just find it kind of mysterious. And then you'd say, yeah, because in essence just is the thing that attributes inhere in. And then if you get an accidental property, well, then it's going to inhere in that, because that's just what an essence does. Yeah.
And is it, but its course, it's more than just a logical. In essence, is more than just something of the order of reason. It's on the order of being, you would say.
I mean, if that's how you understand it, whereas I tend to think in essence just is that set of attributes that explain the kind of being that you are.
So it's like, a logical kind of summary of,
okay. So you've got God, a substance that has these attributes and has them essentially and necessarily. Okay. And then you get some accidental properties along the way when he freely exercises his power.
Very interesting.
Yeah, you have so different metaphysics. So
exactly, yeah. And I didn't even say the crazy stuff where I'm like, God is time, So like,
oh my goodness, yeah, that's
yeah. So I held back a lot on the crazy stuff.
Okay, so any final thoughts? Maybe some conclusion remarks. If you have any.
Yeah. Do you have something?
I would say, just with appreciation to Dr. Mullins, this is very interesting. And I apologize and thank the audience for enduring this, both now or in the future, future viewers, if this goes on and is accessible. And I would just say in 30 seconds that I think, ironically, some of the stuff that Dr. Mullins and I were speaking about, which didn't seem to be directly about divine providence, namely principles, what is being, what does change mean, he and I would agree that's actually where all of this needs to be worked out. So we're talking about providence, freedom, which is out here, but all of those themes come from our basic metaphysical principles. And I think you would agree with that, Dr. Mullins.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. So in my mind, the research I've been doing is trying to identify, here are these different models of God. What are the arguments for and against them? And then hopefully at some point I can go, here's a nice textbook just on them so Christians can make up their own mind. I'm not there yet. Of just laying out them all in different publications. And I think the next step from there is, once you know what God is, you have to ask, what does God do? And then from there, there's certain kinds of questions that pop up that I see a lot in the history of philosophical theology. Namely, why would God create anything at all? And why this particular universe? And the way you answer those questions, that has a huge impact on how you develop your doctrines of predestination, creation, and providence. So these things that we were talking about today, they are fundamental to your systematic theology. And they're fundamental to developing the entire system of Christian thought. So, I think it was cool that we got to talk about some really fundamental issues that hopefully will help people understand what they're thinking in their own heads. But I don't know.
That's fascinating. And if I may, just what is your doctoral work and your habilitation dissertation? What were they both on?
So the doctoral work was on divine timelessness, and so that led to the book called The End of the Timeless God with Oxford. And then the habilitation was on, okay, well, if God's not timeless, well, what on earth does it mean to say God's temporal? Because there's not a really good book that develops that in all the detail. There's some, but nothing. And so I've got this book called From Divine Time Maker to Divine Watchmaker. That's going to come out with Routledge next year. I have to index it. And then it'll be the indexing I have to do this week, actually.
God bless you. I've done indexes. Yeah. Those are indices are a pain.
Yeah, they're awful. But that's going to do is help people understand, if you're even flirting with divine temporality, or if you even want to understand it, there are a lot of options. And what are those options, and how do they handle all manner of different doctrinal issues? and different issues in philosophy of time. So that's what this next book is.
Marvelous. Very interesting.
Yeah, thank you so much, guys. And maybe 10 more seconds. What one book would you recommend on these topics for our listeners to deep dive?
For me, it would be Garrigou-Lagrange's book Reality, followed by Garrigou-Lagrange's book Grace and Providence. Those three books would be the clearest summaries, I would say, if you don't read Latin. One doesn't, which most of us don't.
Yeah. If you want to understand the Molinist view, I mean, some of the best works to go to are Molina's book on Providence that's been translated into English, thankfully, because the Latin is not easy from what I've been told. I don't read Latin, so whatever. And then Thomas Flint has this nice book called like the Molinist account of Providence. So those are two like really good books to get a nice clear account of how this all is supposed to work.
Okay, thank you so much, guys. Thank you for your time. It was really great discussion, and I hope to engage in this discussion in the future. And God bless you, and see you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful.